Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your day to come and listen to my talk. As a photographer, people find it a little bit strange that I'm so enamored and obsessed with Leonardo da Vinci. As a 17-year-old boy beginning my artistic career, I collected the 2,700 pages of Leonardo's notebooks. And in those days, yes, they had cars when I was 17, but it was really hard to find those notebooks collated into one source. So I had to get one volume from the French, one volume from the English, one volume from the Germans. And I spent 10 years reading those notebooks, 2,700 pages. I know today many young people don't want to read, but reading is not an overrated skill or enterprise. So having read those notebooks, I was most impressed with Leonardo's attention to detail and one of his basic premises, which is the title of this talk, was to see things unseen. And those of you who might be familiar with some of those notebooks or the writing or the sketches will remember all these little detailed drawings of water swirling around or hair curling or any of these little details. I was absolutely convinced as a young artist that this is somebody who, had photography existed when he was doing his art, he probably would have put down the paintbrushes and been a photographer, because he was all about studying the effect of light. He was the first person, for example, to discover why the sky is blue, suspended water vapor in the air. He made these observations. He dissected human eyeballs. He discovered that we have more acute color vision in the back of our eye than in the periphery of our eye. So he was very much a student of science, and he used science to give him a better understanding of the natural world, and then he connected his creative to that. So having read those notebooks and been impressed with that approach to see things unseen, that's how I began my photographic career, my artistic career. I started out in photography as a sculptor and a silkscreen artist. Sculpture being a three-dimensional art form, I was always, when I later shifted to photography, I was always interested in carrying a sense of that third dimension into photography, which is a two-dimensional art form. And much of the reading that I did about Leonardo, specifically his discovery of optics and perspective and atmospheric perspective, all of these discoveries that he made absolutely convinced me that he was the father of modern photography. The great artist David Hockney did a book and several films for the BBC a number of years ago called Secret Knowledge. And in that book, Hockney put forth the premise that Leonardo and all of the other great Renaissance artists used some kind of optical device to record their perspective, and then later on they traced the perspective with a pencil or a pen, and later on they would paint it in. And Hockney's book, Secret Knowledge, which I recommend you read if you're interested in photography, is quite fascinating because he does a very detailed analysis of all Renaissance and post-Renaissance painting done from Northern Europe to Southern Europe chronologically by the year. And when the technique involved a mirror, it was a concave mirror called a camera lucida. And this is what Leonardo supposedly used. There's Leonardo did a drawing, which I have in the presentation here. Let's sort of move along here. So this is an example of my influence of this mantra of see the unseen. What you're looking at is nothing physical. There's nothing there that's physical. That's all light and shadow. And it's an optical phenomenon that occurred. It was a light show moving across the wall the first day of the new millennium. And I saw this happening, and it sort of reinforced for me my habit and propensity to never get up early, because this happened at 12 o'clock noon, and if I had been up early and out the door, I never would have seen it. So I saw this light phenomenon that moved across the wall, and it lasted for 10 minutes. So I started recording this with the camera. And I think most of you will think that this doesn't look like a photograph. It looks, to me, more like an airbrush illustration. And as a photographer, all of us, we look at objects, and the shadowing and the dimensionality of it gives us an indication of where the light is coming from. But if we get all of these clues, but the reality is the opposite of what we're actually photographing, it becomes very confusing. So I did this series of photographs, and this optical phenomenon lasted for 10 minutes. And it was during the time of the winter solstice. So for a period of 6 days, I had 10 minutes. Roughly 60 minutes a year, and I photographed it for 4 years. And I made this series of photographs called Solstice. The following year, I introduced a prism into it. So I'm taking these pictures with one hand on the camera and spinning this little prism with the other hand and getting these little colored light things to move around to things. So again, I'm following that mantra of trying to see things unseen. So when I walk down the street and I look at the street, I'm looking for strange shapes, strange patterns. I'm looking for the way light plays off of things. And certainly Leonardo did this. He was a relentless and curious observer of light and how it worked. He studied refraction, reflection, absorption, all of these things. So continuing on with some examples inspired by him. This is another one in that series. If you look at it on a print, it's a little difficult to see on this big screen, but on a print, as you move around it, it sort of looks like this op art from the 70s. As you move, some of those figures change shape on you. It's very interesting. Here was another example of, and remember, this is nothing physical. You're not looking at anything except light and shadow, and then I introduced this prismatic effect to it. This is I'm always doing photographs in museums. I sort of made the term of a guerrilla museum photographer, because in a lot of the museums, they don't want you photographing the art. I find this kind of ironic as an artist, so in now the policies have changed in New York. For example, in the Guggenheim, a year ago, you weren't allowed, you couldn't even take a camera out of your pocket. Now you can take pictures in the Guggenheim. But this I took in the Metropolitan Museum, and it was a huge optical mirror. And by moving very slightly to the left or to the right, I could get all of these different reflections. At the time, there was a big shark in a tank there in formaldehyde, and I was waiting for human figures. You can see there's a face here. I would always wait till there was something human in the picture, and I coined the term abstract figurative minimalism. So I always wanted to have a recognizable figure in there, but again, since I was coming from a three-dimensional art form, I'm trying to bring that third dimension into photography. So by using bokeh, the out of focus area of the picture, and shallow depth of field, and these kinds of things, I'm always trying to reproduce that third dimension. This is an interesting picture. I was in my house in California, and I was walking by one of these old glass jars that was made out of very rippled glass. And I bent down to pick something up off the ground. And as I was getting up, just at a particular angle, I saw this image. So I took a picture with a little camera. I don't take pictures with this. This is for telephone conversations. You know, I don't consider it to be a camera. I know there might be people that are really passionate about iPhones, but I like a real camera. So I shot this with what I consider my iPhone camera, a little camera. But I shot a picture of it and looked at it and thought I liked it. And what it was these Venetian blinds in the distance. And I started to play around with the Venetian blinds and turn them at different angles to sort of modulate the light. It looks fabulous in a print. It loses a little bit of the impact, but actually this is not too bad. So I was impressed with the result that I got with a little camera, so I set the bigger camera up, and I proceeded to, which is what I'm very accustomed to doing, I'll wait in a place for 8 hours and just watch the light. And I'm very, very patient for some things. For other things, I'm not patient at all. But for the light, I have infinite patience. So I watched the light making these changes, and the white spot on the bottom, I turned one of the Venetian blinds so it was reflecting the bright light. And I changed the tonality on all of the other ones by adjusting the blinds in the light before I took the picture. I'm more than somewhat old school, and I try and as much as I can create the art inside the camera. Very little of what I do is done in Photoshop. I try and have a concept and then execute that concept to the best of my ability, and then if I need to resort to something in Photoshop, but I prefer to do it in the camera. And this is really a perfect example of this, see the unseen. Remember, I told you I was bending down and then getting up, and just at this, it had to be an area of maybe 3 or 4 inches disappeared to me. If I was higher, it disappeared. If I was lower, it disappeared. So if you're a photographer, you have to use your eyes all the time and be looking for all of these things. The world displays this wonder to everybody. It's in front of your eyes. It's how you perceive it and how you record it that makes the difference between a great photograph and an excellent photograph. Another one of the sayings of Leonardo's that he had, which has been one of my mantras my whole life, was, let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I am the enemy of the good. I strive for perfection, never to achieve that, but that's my intention. And all of these principles that I'm talking about today, and all of this approach to art, and I'm going to come back to this in the end of my talk, I wrap everything with a blanket of intention. When I go out to take pictures, my intention is to make great artwork. I have a friend who I'm mentoring, and he's taking pictures, and he said, "Oh, but I was just taking a quick picture," and I said to him, "It's your intention that's wrong. It's not your knowledge or the way you approach with the camera. It's your intention. I think when I go to take pictures, everything that I'm doing is a priceless piece of artwork." So that intention has served me quite well for 40-some years. I don't think I'm going to stop. This is an illustration of the camera obscura. I'm sure most people are familiar with this. So this was what Leonardo and the Renaissance artists used. In Hockney's book, Secret Knowledge, he goes through the development, the various stages of the camera obscura. This is actually just a pinhole camera. Doesn't have a lens on it at all. But this was discovered in Arabia some 13 or 1400 years ago. So I have your culture to thank for doing this. The Renaissance artists made it popular. What was actually discovered, I don't have the name at the tip of my tongue, and if I did, I probably would make a fool of myself pronouncing it, but it was discovered 13 or 1400 years ago in Arabia. So this is what, in Hockney's book, he makes, and in these videos from the BBC that he did, he makes a statement and he says, Leonardo da Vinci was no better at drawing than I am. And I thought, well, this is a little bit arrogant, you know, but for those of you that might know David Hockney and know his skill with those tools, it's a pretty accurate assessment. He attempted they set up a faux studio of Leonardo's in Los Angeles for David Hockney, and he attempted to paint this chandelier that had all of these intricate facets going all around the chandelier, and he was unable to do it. And he showed that by using some kind of it's thought that Leonardo used the mirror, and later when Caravaggio was painting, he was using a lens which would turn the image upside down and reverse it from left to right. But it's odd that all of this some of the greatest art produced in the history of art was produced with photographic instruments. So all of us modern day photographers can take a little bit of bow, you know, to having contributed to that. This is one of Leonardo's illustrations for a painting that he never did called Adoration of the Magi. And you can see in these lines of perspective. Everybody can see that quite clear. When I saw this as a young boy, I said, well, how can he be doing this, you know, without a knowledge and an understanding of perspective? If you're not using an optical system, you're not going to see that vanishing point. That's not something we see with our eyes. That's something that's seen through either that camera lucida or the camera obscura. So when I first, and it was for a period of time, this, as it's referred to as a cartoon, was on display in Florence, and apparently it was the most influential piece of artwork in Europe at the time. Artists traveled from all over Europe to look at this drawing. Leonardo never finished the painting. He finished very few paintings, maybe 17 or 18 paintings, and in fact, he worked on the Mona Lisa for 34 years, and he never finished it. I often think that I have some of his DNA in my blood, because if he finished 17 paintings in his lifetime, I'd be satisfied at the end of my life if I had 17 good photographs, not 17,000 photographs. So I'm all about that mantra of let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Here's the famous drawing of the Last Supper. I had the good fortune to see this before, decades ago, before things were changed and that the whole geometry of the room was changed. But this, when you viewed the painting, you were viewing it not from the center, but from the left and too close to the painting. But by using perspective, the receding columns and walls, Leonardo was able to correct that perspective, even though you were in less than the ideal viewing position. This perspective stuff was in my brain for many, many years. And here is the painting that Rubens finally did of that was a copy of that Adoration of the Magi, which Leonardo never finished, but it had all of these details of the horses' heads and the musculature of the horses and everything. And when I saw this painting years and years and years ago, all of this stuff with the horses stood out quite clearly in my mind. And later on, I was able to photograph some horses. And when I did this most recently, I was thinking of that painting of Rubens, the musculature of the horses. I did this. This is not a cropped photograph. This is the full frame of the photograph. Now the horse moves through that frame in maybe a 200th of a second. So either you have to have really good timing, or you have to use some technology together with some good timing. And I was using a Sony camera that shoots 20 frames a second. So I'm able, because I'm interested in the musculature and the expression on the horse's face, on the animal's face, not so much the human. In fact, I was glad in this picture that I couldn't even identify the human. A couple of more examples of that. When I'm talking about see the unseen, here, I don't like to shoot pictures in the high light. This is towards the end of the day, towards sunset. So I have that, again, that image in my brain was of the horses of Rubens in that painting and what Leonardo did. So I like the way the light models and sculpts the horse, and I like the way the horse is suspended in midair. So it's, again, an example of how I'm trying to see things in an unseen way. Since I don't know anything about photographing horses, I'm not a photographer of doing this, I'm just looking for an image that moves me. I'm not looking at, somebody suggested to me, well, you should look at the photographs of the people who do the equine photography, because there's a perfect position for the horse. I'm not interested in the perfect position for the horse. I'm interested in what I like, my aesthetic, and if it pleases me, that's all I need. Here's an example of this perspective thing, and it was influenced when we built this by Leonardo's thing of perspective. This is a room that's built in forced perspective. We all know that if we use a wide-angle lens on a figure, it's going to distort the body of the figure. But I was interested in recording the distortion in the room. So but I didn't want to distort the model by using a long lens. So rather than do that, I had a room built in forced perspective. In the front of the room, it was 15 feet square, and the back wall is 5 foot square. And I had all the walls built in forced perspective. And then I had a decorator cover it with $6,000 worth of French satin. So I was able to make, and it was a $20,000 structure to build that. But I wanted to have that forced perspective. So again, it's something from my early experience and my exposure to Leonardo that I carried through to the decades that I was working as a commercial photographer. I had the ability to see things and then remember them, and then years later when I have an opportunity to sort of pull them out like an extra tool that one would have in a tool bag and use that when I thought it was appropriate. This is another example of perspective, and this was an image that I did especially for Exposure 2018. It was a series of pictures that I did inspired. I was at the Parthenon in Greece some 35 or 40 years ago, and I saw the temple frieze with the Amazon women and Hercules. And that stayed in my brain for all of those years, 35, 40 years. I had the opportunity to photograph this wonderful ballerina, Irina Dvorovenko, who was the prima ballerina with American Ballet Theater for some 25 years. And she had been dancing since she was 4 years old. I think she was probably 34 at this point, so she had 30 years of experience as a dancer. And my concept was to create this temple frieze and have it be a juxtaposition. And I called the photograph Black Swan versus White Swan. And I wanted the white swan to be this feminine, lyrical, soft form, and I wanted the black swan to be the more masculine. That's why the figure is slightly larger, more masculine, more demonic entity. So we spent 13 hours doing these photographs in the studio, and all of the background, you see all of the clouds there, was all created in camera. That's nothing done in Photoshop. The only thing that was done in Photoshop was the compositing of the various images. And I shot it on a very, very high resolution camera, so we made a print that was about the size of what you see on the wall. And at that size, the ballerina was actually larger than life size, and when it opened at the gallery in California where I showed this, I had the ballerina there with the costume, and she looked like she just stepped out of the photograph. Here is the Mona Lisa. This is really the merging of Leonardo's art and science. At the time when he was working on this painting, at the same time he was doing that, he was dissecting human cadavers. And he dissected more than 100 of human cadavers. And during this particular period when he was making the painting, he was dissecting the face muscles and knew what muscles controlled the lower part of the smile and knew what muscles control the top part of the smile. So again, it's this merging of art and science that I firmly believe that without that experimentation, which is a little bit on the gruesome side, that he wouldn't have achieved this, and a lot of historians agree with that also. But it's so this photograph represents his whole lifetime in this photograph. It's all of Leonardo's personal experiences and all of his professional experiences. The background, the atmospheric perspective, all of the geology in the background, the mountains and the rock formations, apparently they're all very accurate in terms of geology. So it's a fascinating study, and I've always been enamored with the woman's expression there, that enigmatic smile. Another one of the paintings, the Adoration of the Magi. A later painting by Caravaggio. This is clearly done with some kind of optical system. You can see the reflection in the mirror there. As a photographer, I look at this and I'm absolutely certain that this is something that's done with an optical system. And at this point, it's my understanding that the lens had been developed. So Caravaggio was doing this with a camera obscura, so he could trace this very, very accurately. Only the problem during those particular years was that it would reverse the figure left to right. And in the Renaissance time in Europe, anything that was left-handed was seen as evil. It came from the word sinister, the Latin sinister. So if you depicted something in a painting or a photograph that was left-handed, you weren't looked upon very kindly. So if it was done because it was a necessity. Later on, they discovered that if you took that image and shined it back into that same mirror, that it would turn everything up, right side up, and reverse it left to right. So when Hockney did his research and chronicled all of these paintings from 1500 to 1600, you could see where the camera lucida was, where the camera obscura, where the lens was developed, and where the camera obscura was. So it's a very interesting, if you can watch those videos, and by all means get the book. Another painting of Caravaggio's. This one is called Card Sharps, and as you can see, the two models on the right and the left are identical. They're the same person. So Caravaggio had the figures go into different positions and traced them. And when he was doing the figure in the back, the guy in the back is supposed to be cheating and looking at this guy's cards and giving this fellow some indication of what is in his hands, but he's actually looking at the back of the guy's head, not at the cards. So he got a little bit of that off with the camera obscura. Another painting of Caravaggio's looks very, very photographic with the water in this vase, the reflection and the distortion of it. These were all things that the artists had been using for years and years and years, but never told anybody anything about them. That's why it was called secret knowledge. And Leonardo often said, one of his quotes was, there are three classes of people: those who see, those whom see when they are shown, and those who do not see. So I propose to you, which class do you want to belong to? It's a decision that we all have to make. This is from a series of photographs I did at the ballet, and when I did this, I was reading that book on Hockney, and I was thinking about these Renaissance photographs with the chiaroscuro, the dark shadowing and everything. So when I again, as I mentioned earlier, when I'm going to do a project, I wrap everything with this intention. I focus what my intention is, what I'm trying to show, what my vision is. So I've been doing this series of backstage photographs of these ballerinas. It's a difficult situation to work on because it's totally black, it's totally dark. I don't have, it's so dark that I have to have a flashlight to see what's going on with the camera. But, and I have the camera in the silent mode, so the ballerinas don't have any idea that I'm taking their pictures. So I'm looking for this expression, this anticipation, this just this very, very intimate moment between the ballerina and her anticipation. She's about to go onto stage, and a lot of times the pictures are taken. The light comes up for maybe 2 seconds. I'm in the total darkness. The light comes up for 2 seconds, and then 2 seconds later, the ballerina goes onto the stage. Again, I'm working on these series of pictures, and I'm thinking about these Renaissance portraits. And I'm thinking about Leonardo, and I'm thinking about Caravaggio. So I'm trying to wrap that intention around those photographs. I think it's really important as a photographer to master a good understanding of light and a good understanding of how your camera operates. When I get a new camera, I spend weeks or whatever time it is to thoroughly familiarize myself with the controls of the camera. I'm always looking to make the camera disappear. I don't want the controls of the camera or any kind of mechanical thing to get in between me and the vision. I want to be able to see and express that through the camera. So I don't want the camera to slow me down. And the only way you can do that is if you know how to work the camera. I talk to so many students and ask them, well, what f-stop did you shoot that at? What shutter speed? And ask them these questions. And they're not certain of those questions. If you don't know those questions, you don't have, it's sort of like going for a ride on a horse and throwing the reins over the horse's head and let the horse take you in whatever direction. Sometimes that can be an interesting ride, sometimes it can be not so interesting. So I encourage everybody to learn the craft of what it is that you're doing. And with photography, there's a certain amount of understanding of optics and things like that. I spent decades studying these various things. I was fortunate to have spent some time with Ansel Adams, and I learned the zone system and learned how to make these magnificent black and white prints, of which Ansel was the absolute master in the history of photography, doing those prints. And in making those prints, he developed this system called the zone system, which was a way for compensating over the lack of control of outdoor light. But he was not interested in the process, he was interested in the end result. But having watched him do that, and having it ingrained to me by him that the most important part of photography was the print. He said the job is never done until the print is finished. And I was in my early 20s when I had that experience. So I carried that analog experience, and then when digital world came about, I carried that same paradigm that I had learned in the analog world, working with very, very particular controls over the camera to enable me to get a vision and to get something. Like when I'm processing this file, you can see even on these screens, there's no burned out areas of extreme white. You have to be most concerned about the highlights in a photograph, and the shadows you can recover very easily in your processing. So again, it's that marriage of art and science which I learned from those 2,700 pages of Leonardo's in those years. Some more studies of the ballerinas. I always make the print shortly after I take the photograph. That's what validates what my vision is, and if there's something wrong with the print, I don't go into Photoshop and make that correction in Photoshop. I go back and reprocess the raw file, or if I'm really unhappy with the result, I'll go back and shoot the picture again. Here's another example of what I thought was a sort of a Renaissance approach to the ballerina. And this I had done shortly after seeing the exhibition in New York City of the girl with the pearl earring. And I spent probably 3 or 4 hours looking at that painting and was looking for sort of that feeling, and she's wearing a pearl earring there. So that was my inspiration there. some more horse photography. Again, it's not the perfect position for the horse, but I like the horse's tail. So I'm looking for my vision and looking for seeing something that's, maybe unseen. I make these prints huge, 40 by 60 inches. And at 40 by 60 inches, you can count the eyelashes on the horse's eyelash. So I like to use the medium format cameras for that reason also. Some flower. Living in New York City. I've been teaching photography at the New York Botanical Garden for a number of years, and this was inspired by the paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe. So I did these series of photographs of flowers, and I taught a series of lectures at the New York Botanical Garden on. They had a show of O'Keeffe's paintings and the flowers. So again, I'm looking for this vision that is, my interpretation of seeing something unseen. It's an iris. Many people have seen it, but I'm putting the petals in the foreground out of focus, and I'm working with a lens, a long lens that gives me very, very shallow depth of field and gives me that effect that I'm looking at. When I'm shooting the photographs, I'm always thinking from my experience with Ansel what the print is going to look like, and I'll work backwards through the technology to give me that file that's going to give me the image, which process he called pre-visualization, which is what I apply. This image is in my exhibition. Many times when I'm doing the flowers like that, I'm imagining being a bee on the surface of the flower. So the intention is to make these huge prints, so to give the viewer sort of the feeling of what it would be like to be an insect on the flower. A photograph at an infinity pool in California some years ago. Just putting the horizon line in the middle and seeing these two halves mimicking the other. This is a photograph using ultraviolet light. I was a pioneer, and I invented this in the mid-1980s. It's a very interesting process. It's using a lens that's made out of quartz, not glass. And the property of quartz is that it just passes ultraviolet light, not visible light. So I did this experimentation developing. People had done pictures with those blacklight tubes for a long time, but this was done with electronic flash, and I had to invent these filters that went over the electronic flash that absorbed all the light and just passed ultraviolet light. The downside of that was that the filters got hot and the glass would shatter. And I've got a girl there, and I've got these glass going to go into her face. So I have to construct plexiglass up there. So there were challenges. You couldn't use a light meter. A light meter wouldn't read ultraviolet light. It didn't show up on the Polaroid. You had to worry about the glass exploding in the model's face, and you had to work in total darkness. Other than that, it was real easy. So I spent 3 months developing this technique, and again, it was another example of, seeing things unseen and using science and marrying that science with technology to be able to do that. Another example of that, here we introduced fluorescent dyes into the makeup, into the model's makeup. And this is the last slide in the show, and this is a photograph that I did several days ago here at the hotel. And I showed it to many people, and everybody had a different, these are actually folded umbrellas, but very few people identified these as folded umbrellas. Some people thought they looked like soldiers or warriors or something like that, but it has a very mystical, abstract, surreal, and then obviously the bird being there at the perfect position. So I was down at the pool 6:15 in the morning for days. Remember, I told you I wait and wait and wait. Infinite patience to do something like this, and it had to be a day where there was no wind, so I would have that complete calm to the infinity pool there, and I just saw this image and saw the birds flying by and set the camera up and just waited, and I only have a window of about 10 minutes, and then the light changes and it's no good. And I've been back 4 days since I did this picture to see if I can improve. I was not able to improve upon it, but this is my, and I was so glad that I produced this photograph here because I've been so inspired by my experience here. And so this was sort of a mystical representation of that inspiration. So with that, I'm going to close my talk on See the Unseen. So this is what I would like everybody here to be inspired by, to go out there and use your eyes and try and see things unseen. So if anybody has any questions for me, I'd be glad to answer them.